Now, as promised, let's return to our main story, the protests in Hong Kong and Beijing's condemnation of the violence, which they said trampled the rule of law. The demonstrations have been going on for weeks over plans to allow suspects to be extradited to mainland China. Well, let's talk about this for the next few minutes. I'm joined in the studio by Kerry Allen, China media analyst from BBC Monitoring. But first, let's head to Hong Kong and Bonnie Lourdes from the Civil Human Rights Front, which has been organising the mass protest movement over the last few weeks. Thank you very much for being here on today's programme. For someone organising these protests, was yesterday a success or a failure?
Well, yesterday, our protest, which had 550,000 people who joined, and also repeating our 5 demands to the Hong Kong government, is obviously a success. But of course, I think what you mean is that what happened in the Legislative Council, which the Hong Kong government has said that it is violent and condemned about these young protesters, and I totally disagree with them because what's forced the young protesters who do this is because their voice is not heard by the Legislative Council, and also have not been heard by the government.
So hang on a second. You do not condemn the violence, the ransacking that we saw for many hours that went on yesterday, and the pictures we're really showing now. You don't condemn any of that violence?
No one can condemn these desperate, despair young protesters before they condemn about the tyranny of the Hong Kong government of turning a deaf ear to 2 million Hong Kong people.
Well, hang on a second.
Peacefully protested.
Hang on a second. You were saying that you organised the peaceful part of that protest, the much bigger part of the protest. All of those people were able to actually make their point, but not get involved in the sorts of scenes and violence and destruction that we saw there.
Well, right, but as the world has seen that 1 million people and 2 million people took to the streets, and Hong Kong government decided to turn a deaf ear to all these protesters, and our 5 demands had none of it had been answered by Carrie Lam, and that is why the young protesters.
The trouble is, instead of looking at your demands, all the authorities are now talking about is the violence. All Beijing is talking about is the violence. You've played into their hands, haven't you? This has backfired.
Well, I cannot condemn the young protesters. As I said, they are forced to do this because they're desperate, because the government turned deaf ear. But I do not say that I can totally agree with that strategy. But what I'm saying is that no one should blame these protesters before they condemn the government, because the government is what forced the protester to do this. And the government are turning a deaf ear to all of our peaceful protests, not only in the past few weeks, but also for years and decades of turning a deaf ear.
Just a final question.
That is the root of the problem, yes.
Just a final question to you. Do you worry at all that Beijing may lose patience and act against these sort of protests and growing protests we've seen? And what did you make of the warning from China to the UK yesterday to basically stay out of this, that this was an internal Chinese matter?
Well, I believe that everyone should care about the values that Hong Kong people are fighting for. We are fighting for freedom. We are fighting for rule of law and human rights. Of course, UK will support that as well. And also, the UK had signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration with Beijing decades ago. And according to this joint declaration, Beijing should let Hong Kong to have one country, 2 systems for 50 years. And we're still in these 50 years. And of course, because the UK has signed this with Beijing, UK has the responsibility to ask Beijing to hold on to their promises and do not intervene with Hong Kong's internal affairs as promised in the Basic Law and also the joint declarations.
Bonnie Lourdes, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Let's turn to Kerry Allen, that's been monitoring a lot of the coverage, certainly how Beijing is viewing this, and how much did people in China, mainland China, see of anything that we had on our screens throughout the course of yesterday?
And it was such dramatic footage as well, but actually in mainland China people have seen very, very little whatsoever. So a lot of traditional newspapers that would normally give a lot of, a lot of detail to stories like this, Global Times and Reference News, what they've been showing instead is basically their front pages are about China and the US trade. There's also one paper, People's Daily, I mean that's known as the government mouthpiece in mainland China, and what that's had instead is a picture of people assembled in a certain way, so they spell out the words I love HK Hong Kong, and it says underneath 22 years old, happy birthday, and mentions the handover yesterday.
Just a brief final point, social media also blocked as well. Have you seen anything that gives you even a clue as to that question I just asked there from our contributor in Hong Kong of just how much patience Beijing has with the protests on this?
It has a lot of patience. I mean, it's not going to back down because as well as the anniversary for handover yesterday, it's also the 98th anniversary of the Communist Party being founded. So there's a real emphasis on Communist Party strength. I mean, this particular bill as well, China supported it, the extradition bill. So, yeah, they were basically, then they can just black out international coverage. They've got that power on social media. There's no reason that they should allow citizens to see this is happening. They can say Communist Party's been around for 98 years. It's very strong.
Kerry Allen, thanks very much for all of that.